Hi, everyone. Joseph Lavoie here. Welcome to Power Shifts. And if you're watching this, you can see I'm looking incredibly jet lagged. That's just because I've landed in London. I did not have time to record before publishing the Substack on the weekend. So hence the slight delay in getting you this on the podcast feed. But this week, I have a pretty lengthy piece on my Substack, and it's titled Why Changing Minds is Harder Than Ever. And I explore why motivated reasoning and tribalism are getting in the way of persuasion efforts. So let's get into it. Changing minds has never been harder. And this is something I've been experiencing so much more in many of the campaigns that I'm running. And it's not because we lack persuasive arguments, but because people simply are not listening. There were two moments in the last week that got me thinking about the challenges we increasingly face in the public affairs environment. The first is around dismissing expertise too quickly. My own family member did not listen to a recent episode of my Craft Politics podcast because a few minutes in, they decided our guest speaker was biased and not worth listening to. Turns out, had my family member actually listened to the full interview, they would have discovered that our guest actually made many of the points they made to me on the topic we were analyzing. And the second thing that occurred is in the conversations with someone who was wanting to pick my brain about all things related to conservative politics, the person I was engaging with was really struggling to empathize. I was asked what it would take to depolarize political discourse. And the person asking me this question was having a hard time comprehending how any individual could support Trump or Poilievre. And the same person understood at an intellectual level why these voters vote the way they do, but had a hard time actually empathizing with these people. These two experiences highlight a growing problem for public affairs professionals. Motivated reasoning and tribalism are making persuasion harder than ever. And that starts with, of course, echo chambers. Society is increasingly split into ideological camps that filter information to fit their pre-existing beliefs. Silos and echo chambers are no longer a fringe issue. They are the default for how people consume information. I'm going to say that again because I think it's really important. Silos and echo chambers are no longer the fringe, right? They are the default way in which people are consuming information. And this did not start with the pandemic. In 2014, the Pew Research Center found that in the United States, for example, Republicans and Democrats are, quote, more divided along ideological lines, and partisan antipathy is deeper and more extensive than any point in the last 2 decades, unquote. And that was before Trump, before TikTok, before the balkanization of news consumption on platforms like Reddit, YouTube, Discord, and WhatsApp. It used to be that partisans disagreed on a shared set of facts and even maybe disagreed while still holding the same set of values. But no more. Today, partisans not only disagree on policy, they inhabit entirely different realities. And so what's happening is people are doubling down on their beliefs in spite of the facts. And history shows that when confronted with evidence that contradicts deeply held beliefs, people don't reconsider. They actually double down on their pre-existing views. An example of this is the Iraq War. So in 2005, as evidence mounted that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, research found that conservative participants, shown this corrective information, actually became more convinced that Iraq did have WMDs. This is called the backfire effect. So rather than updating their views, people dig in even deeper. And we see the same dynamic today. So despite no credible evidence of widespread fraud in the 2020 U.S. election and dozens of court cases debunking such claims, large segments of the public remain convinced that that election was stolen. And a 2023 poll found that over 50% of New Hampshire Republicans believe President Biden's 2020 victory was fraudulent, a view shared by 85% of those identifying as strong Trump supporters. But before you blame Republicans, keep this in mind. Social psychologists note, quote, it happens across the political spectrum, unquote, as people readily accept stories that flatter their side and dismiss facts that challenge their worldview. There's even a name for it, naive realism, the belief that our own worldview is the most rational while others are hopelessly biased. For example, some left-leaning citizens eagerly believed in false online rumor about a political opponent because it confirmed their suspicions. In case after case, when core beliefs or identity are on the line, presenting contradictory evidence often leads people to entrench further in their original position rather than relent. What drives this pervasive resistance to persuasion? It's a question I've obsessed over my entire career, and I'm not alone. Decades of research in psychology and political science point to motivated reasoning, the subconscious tendency to fit facts to a predetermined conclusion that aligns with one's desire or group identity. People don't process information neutrally. Instead, they rely on three powerful biases. Number one, confirmation bias, and that's seeking out and embracing information that aligns with pre-existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Number two, disconfirmation bias, where you're scrutinizing, counter-arguing, and rejecting opposing viewpoints more aggressively than those that confirm our own. And the third is identity protective cognition, defending the beliefs of our social or ideological group, even in the face of contradictory evidence. And we do that to maintain our identity. So those three again: confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, identity protective cognition. These biases act as the psychological armor, so they shielding people's pre-existing beliefs from change. And that's because facts alone don't change minds that are motivated not to change. If the mind doesn't want to change, it's not going to change no matter the facts. Let's talk about the limits of fact-based messaging. It's a topic I talked about often on LinkedIn and in my old version of this podcast. But I'm going to sort of get a little bit deeper on it today. So despite the fact that facts don't change minds, we often as campaigners and as public affairs professionals, we just cannot help ourselves when we're designing campaigns or messaging, right? We default to using digital outreach, advertising blitzes, and rapid response fact-checking, all in the name of trying to sway public opinion in our favor. You know, it's a mantra that I've heard from clients often, but the facts are on our side. If only more people understood the facts, we'd win. It's what I call issue delusion. And it's one of the big reasons so few campaigns get the traction they want. That's because evidence shows that tactics are usually these tactics are usually insufficient to penetrate entrenched beliefs on their own. The spray and pray approach of blasting audiences with facts, data, or ads runs up against the mental firewalls described above. Studies find that even well-intentioned fact checks backfire. Political scientists Brendan Nayan and Jason Riefler observed that corrections, quote, frequently fail to reduce misperceptions among the targeted ideological groups, unquote. And in some cases, corrections actually increase misperceptions as committed partisans double down in response. In other words, presenting people with evidence, debunking a false claim can reinforce that belief if it threatens their identity or their worldview. How often have you seen this play out online, right? A myth-busting article intended to set the record straight ends up being rejected as biased by those who needed it most, who then become even more convinced of the original false narrative. Why do information campaigns so often hit a dead end? One reason is that they typically operate on a deficit model of communication, assuming that the target audience simply lacks information and that providing the correct facts will change their mind. In reality, decades of experience show this assumption is flawed. People do not approach new information as blank slates. As one behavioral scientist explains, past experiences and beliefs can act as a perceptual filter through which all new facts are interpreted. In many conversational domains, a person's cultural and political identities have a greater influence in shaping opinions than actual knowledge about the topic. We saw this in COVID, right? Simply giving people more scientific data about vaccine safety will not persuade those whose identities are tied to skepticism on those issues. They view the information through an ideological filter, often dismissing it as fake or untrustworthy. The deficit model is consistently faulty, and yet it's the first thing we grab for when we need to educate people about our cause or our issue. And we do this in the face of digital media and echo chambers, which reinforce motivated reasoning rather than overcome it. Online, people self-select news sources and communities that reflect their existing views, and that's confirmation bias in action, right? Misleading claims spread quickly among like-minded followers, while corrective voices struggle to gain traction. The modern fake news epidemic is driven as much by our psychological tribalism as by the tools of technology themselves. And we tend to label any countervailing information as fake simply because it challenges our worldview. So let's be real. No volume of tweets or banner ads will convert someone who is psychologically motivated to reject the source. For public affairs campaigns, the implication is sobering. Data dumps, fact sheets, digital ad campaigns alone rarely break through entrenched beliefs. And if anything, a barrage of facts from the other side can trigger a reflexive pushback. So to truly shift opinions, we need a different approach, one that goes beyond broadcasting information and instead engages people at a human level. This is where deep in-person conversations come into play. While people resist impersonal persuasion, they can be reached through deep, meaningful conversations. Growing evidence suggests that face-to-face dialogue, built on trust, empathy, and personal connection, is one of the few strategies that can soften defenses and open minds in a lasting way. This approach is called deep canvassing. It involves longer, empathetic discussions rather than transactional exchanges. So instead of arguing or overwhelming someone with facts, the persuader, the canvasser, asks questions, listens, and shares personal stories. Pioneering research by UC Berkeley's David Brookman and Yale's Joshua Kalla has shown that even one 10-minute conversation, on a contentious issue can substantially reduce prejudice for months. These conversations work because they tap into personal reflection rather than triggering defensive reactions. These brief but thoughtful exchanges, which included the canvasser asking the voter to reflect on a time they themselves felt judged or ostracized, produced a greater drop in bias than would normally occur over a decade of societal change. Notably, the attitude change persisted even when the voters were later exposed to opposing campaign messages, indicating that something fundamental had shifted in their perspective. It goes against everything we know to be true about modern-day communications. In a world of short-form content, don't we need to figure out how to deliver a message in 3 seconds? Well, maybe if you're selling a product, but when selling an idea, a policy change, you need more than 3 seconds. And this is what I find compelling about these studies. A respectful conversation achieved what countless advertising efforts and fact sheets alone could not. Similarly, Brookman and Kalla found that when advocates ask questions, listen sincerely, and engage people with stories, they significantly increase their chances of changing minds on hot-button issues. That's because data fails, especially compared to human stories and lived experiences. Listening is more powerful than talking, so give someone a voice and listen to their concerns, and in doing so, they will lower their defensive walls. It's more humane and effective than lecturing them. And when we're pumping out facts and correcting the record in our campaigns, what we're doing is we're lecturing, and we're giving people the reason to put up their defensive walls. The power of deep conversation lies in building personal connection and trust, which can alleviate the identity threat that fuels motivated reasoning. In a one-on-one conversation, individuals feel more respected and less attacked than when they see an opposing argument in a Facebook post or a TV ad. They have space to explain their perspective and, more importantly, feel heard. So a skilled conversationalist can then gently introduce new viewpoints or facts in a non-confrontational way, often by sharing their own story and finding common ground, so showing vulnerability as well. This method doesn't trigger the same knee-jerk rejected to defend reaction that a blunt fact check might. Instead, it invites reflection. Psychologically, the person's motivation shifts. They no longer see the interaction as a zero-sum battle between tribes, but as a mutual search for understanding. Sure, not every conversation will succeed. Meaningful dialogue takes time and effort, but the evidence of what can work gives hope that even in today's polarized climate, minds can be changed one conversation at a time. So let's talk about some strategies for deep engagement. What does this all mean? Well, I think it's time to get sober on the limits of traditional outreach and instead prioritize deep engagement over communicating. Here's how. Step 1, it's time to ditch digital for in-person wherever possible. Okay, I'm not saying period. I'm not saying strictly ditch digital, but if there are opportunities to replace digital with in-person, choose the in-person, okay? It's going to get you so much more in the longer term. And what you might want to consider is organizing trained volunteers to engage in face-to-face discussions instead of relying on impersonal digital outreach. You might want to equip your canvassers to ask open-ended questions and listen more than they talk. And this isn't cheap. Getting people to canvas, doing door-to-door, doing face-to-face is not a cheap part of a campaign. You'll have to put the appropriate resources to it. But you know what's more expensive? Failing to engage your community, failing to change minds, and ultimately losing. And no one likes losing. Okay, so that's number one. Step two, consider using narrative framing instead of data. Humans are storytelling creatures, and so you might want to consider framing advocacy in terms of values and emotions rather than just facts. So example, instead of using climate change statistics, share a farmer's story about how erratic weather has affected their crops. Make it personal. Make it about the person. And narrative framing also involves aligning the issue with the audience's core values. Research in moral psychology shows that reframing a message in terms of the values of the listener can make them more receptive. So, for example, environmental protection can be framed in terms of purity, in terms of cleanliness, a value that resonates with conservative audiences, or national pride in our national heritage, rather than in terms of preventing harm to distant others, right? Make it personal. Similarly, a public health campaign might frame vaccination as an expression of community loyalty and protection for one's neighbors. By telling stories and invoking shared values, you reduce the instinct for the audience to see the issue as a us versus them problem. Instead, what you're doing is you're inviting them to see themselves in the story. Listening to your audience's values and fears should inform how you frame your narrative. In practice, this could mean adjusting campaign messaging after holding focus groups or town halls to hear how the public talks about the issue in their own words. Let those real concerns guide the story you tell, but also don't dismiss what you hear if it doesn't line up with your expectations. The voter is always right, even when they're wrong. And finally, step three, if you can, find a way to embed empathy into the campaign strategy directly, not an afterthought. So invest in active listening training for teams. But the bigger thing is to inject empathy into everything you do. Actively look to spend time with your constituents or with your key audiences, not just to say you have, but to listen to how they feel. And embed empathy into the campaign plan itself. Allocate resources and time for deep engagement. For instance, budget for field organizers who specialize in community dialogue, or schedule fewer but more interactive public meetings rather than a plethora of one-way press releases and social media content that doesn't get the traction you want. And consider setting metrics that value quality of engagement more than quantity, right? So number of substantive conversations held, shifts in sentiment and follow-up surveys, testimonials from participants whose views have evolved, in addition to the quantity of impressions or clicks. So importantly, ensure leadership buy-in on your campaign. Senior decision makers should champion the idea that changing minds is a long game. It takes time, doesn't happen overnight. And we know that because we live in an increasingly fragmented world, and to do things well in person is not particularly scalable. So you have to get that level of buy-in and understanding. But ultimately, get to a place where you empower teams to prioritize relationship building with the public. So let's bring all this to a close. It's a long one today. In a fragmented, tribalized public arena, changing minds is extraordinarily hard work, but it's work that must be done, and it can be done, just not en masse and not in a scalable way. Mass messaging and digital ad targeting will continue to yield diminishing returns when audiences' mental guards are up. So if you're serious about shifting public opinion, you'll need to embrace the harder path of authentic engagement. Changing minds one by one is slow, painstaking, and often uncomfortable. But it is the only reliable way to combat the balkanization of public opinion. So if you want to slow the splintering of society into isolated ideological camps, which is a question I was posed at the start of the week, we have to do the unglamorous work of talking with people, not at them. There we are. That's the pod for this week. I hope you find this interesting. You can find the full article of this on Substack. You can find that at powershifts.pro. And really appreciate you taking the time to listen today. If you haven't already, do subscribe to the podcast so I can make sure I pop in your feed.